44% of Gen Z men agree that when it comes to giving women equal rights, things have gone far enough. 45% of men believe that we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men. And 47% of Gen Z men agree that masculinity is under attack. These are stats reflected in the new report from Channel 4 called Gen Z Trends, Trust and Truth. So Gen Z, who are 13 to 28 years old, are a generation deeply influenced by the UK's economic instability, delayed milestones, and a culture merging digital and real worlds. This report shows that for Gen Z, truth is no longer a given. In this conversation, we will explore how media and the economy are shaping the lives of young boys, their political views, mental health, aspirations, and importantly, their attitudes towards gender roles and ideas of masculinity. So today we welcome two people who are key to developing the research. We have James, who spent 12 years as an audience planner at Channel 4, and Konrad, co-founder at Craft, which is an award-winning strategic insight agency that's worked with Channel 4 on the research. Welcome, fellas, and thank you for being here.
All right,
Thank you for having us.
Let's get straight into it. So the report found some interesting stats around the mental health challenges, loneliness, and economic stress that Gen Z experience, and also how much more concerned they are about their looks and appearance and the basic needs around employment and ability to afford a house. It feels like it's really, really hard to be a young person now. Do you think it's harder to be a young person now than it was for us when we were young in the late 90s and early 2000s? I think we're all about the same kind of age on this call. What do you think? Is it harder now, or are we just seeing
very
this
generous of you, Elliot?
Is it fundamentally harder? I don't think things have fundamentally changed about being a young person. It's a time of great change in your life. It's one of the reasons we looked at doing the research and talking to groups at age 13, 16, 18, 21 within that generation, because there are these sort of key inflection points when things are always changing for you. And I think that's always been the case. I mean, the things that you flagged there, what you look like, what your future success is going to be, whether you're going to be able to afford a home, what kind of job you're going to get. Those are perennial. Those are true of whatever generation you're growing up in. They were true when I grew up in the 80s. They're true now. I think what's changed is that the world that they are growing up into probably feels more fragile, a little bit more fraught, probably much more polarized than perhaps it did certainly in the 90s or in the early noughties. And so the effect of that is probably making those changes that everybody goes through as they mature and as they become a young adult, is making them feel a little bit more fraught.
Yeah, I think the way that we phrase it is that it's a confusing time of life, and that's true for all young people and has been for a long time at that age, but they're coming of age at very confusing times. And those times are confusing not just for younger people, they're confusing for lots of, you see what happened last week and, the debates around, what is a woman? These were just taken as givens when we were growing up. And I don't want to get into the, whatever people think the rights and wrongs of that are, but, it's not just cultural stuff, it's socioeconomic stuff. Social mobility is on the decrease hugely. So the social contract's breaking down. You don't necessarily get out what you put in, which is one of the basics that we were told. Right, work hard and you'll have the house and the car or the good job if that's what you want, right? There's far less space to make mistakes because of social media. We're all experimenting, we're all making mistakes at those ages. I am so pleased there was no social media and camera phones around when I was a kid, So some things don't change and some things do. And that's a theme of the research all the way through.
Yeah, I'm so lucky I grew up in a generation where there wasn't smartphones. Like, I was online the other day on Instagram and there was a blog page and it showed a boy and a girl in a club kissing each other, and it went viral. And everyone was like, oh my gosh, how are they kissing in the club? And I'm like, that's nothing. We were doing way worse than that when I was at uni, but there was no camera phones. So you could do stuff and whoever was there and it was all good. So I can see how it's so much harder now. I want to kind of talk a little bit about some of the bigger picture stuff right here around employment and the economy and education as well. So where I live is a decent enough area, but I have noticed over the last 5 years or so, probably since COVID, there's a lot more homelessness, a lot more drug taking, and especially a lot more young men like hanging around. And I have a 9-year-old who wants to adventure and explore. And I'm trying to let her go to the shop by herself, for example. And over the weekend, we had to have some very grown-up conversations about some of the characters that she's seeing around. The report shows the emerging attainment crisis across education, employment, and income. A gap is growing between men and women. The report shows that by the age of 19, 54% of women are in higher education versus 40% of men, a trend echoed in the labour force where young women aged 20 to 24 have a higher employment rates and out-earn young men on average. And shockingly, 1 in 3 young men are economically inactive, a figure that has doubled since the early 90s, 2 million young men out of work. So from your research and report and your work, what have you found to be the reasons as to why men are falling behind in education and employment? And what do you think the impact is then on their lives, their thoughts, their feelings, how they engage with the world?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've hit on lots of the points already, Elliot, there. So you obviously know what you're talking about because
I read the report.
Yeah.
It helps.
Well, I mean,
my research, Konrad.
Yeah, very good, very good. You're preaching to the converted. Look, I mean, there is really big macro stuff, right? Deindustrialization, the rewiring of the economy towards a service-led economy, but is that necessarily providing jobs for what were traditionally young men? Are they being reskilled to fill those jobs? We'd argue no. I mean, with the education stuff, we've got to be careful. We're not educators, right? So, and some of this stuff is contentious. But there is at least a school of thought, and there is some evidence to show that actually the way that we measure and school our children is actually biased to get better results from young women on average. Age and gender are not the only things. There are massive geographical differences. Near where I am, in southwest London, is Wimbledon. Sends almost 75% of children to university. Harrow sends 14%. That is how big the differences are in this country. So there's all this big socioeconomic stuff going on. I think within the educational system, 2 things have been pointed towards. One is the move to more coursework, educational attainment, which is just literally we are measuring attainment differently. And since 1980, as measurement towards coursework as coursework has basically taken up a bigger part of people's marks, essentially, that supposedly favors the way that girls learn, girls underperform boys in exams generally, right? The other thing, though, and this is, in a sense, it's a good news story, but one that's had an unintended consequences. We've worked, and the education system has worked very hard over years to remove the barriers of sexism that there were in the education sector, going back decades. And not to say that they don't exist anymore, but by doing that, and encouraging female attainment and female encouragement while not necessarily supporting boys in the same way, because there was an assumption that the system just worked for them. There's probably been what some people have called an overcorrection, right? And that now we haven't. So we sort of need to put in the same kind of effort that we did with girls to understand that maybe the system isn't necessarily working as well for boys, and to try and close that gap, because, well, depends what your politics are and how you view the world. But generally, I come from we should all kind of have the same chances kind of worldview, no more, no less than that. And at the moment, it seems that some boys do not.
Let's talk about politics. So unfortunately in America, Trump and Elon Musk, 2 of the biggest characters and probably the most influential people around the world at the moment, definitely exude a certain type of masculinity. And we can see how they are just idolized by so many young men. And we know that there is a emerging gap in regards to young people's political ideology. The report notes that while young men remain more liberal than conservative, young women are becoming significantly more progressive, particularly on issues like immigration and racial justice. What do you think this means for the political world going forward, how political parties message to young people and how young people engage with politics going forward?
So what we're seeing there is that a cohort of young men, right, are not as liberal as pretty much everyone else in the generation, men and women, or boys and girls as well, right? So they're pulling the average down. If we're talking about degrees of liberalness, most young men are as liberal as young women, right? It's that 20 to 30%. So that chart that you see where the lines are going like this is very bad podcasting, but where the lines are separating is because some young men are dragging that down. Now that is essentially a chart about voting intention. So what party are you going to vote for in the next election, which isn't necessarily the same as values, right? And that's one thing around but these things all get conflated and end up with these kind of narratives around Gen Z isn't one generation, it's two. You've got liberal women and conservative men. And that's not true. And I know that's not what you said, but I just wanted to make that point. In terms of actually answering your question, why is that and what is that? Well, I think, again, we've got to take a step back and just understand that lots of young people, as well as lots of older people, are pretty disillusioned and disenfranchised of party politics generally. And when you look at young people, they're not actually apolitical at all. They can have very strong views on lots of things. But the reason that they're disengaged from party politics is actually quite a rational analysis of policy and what's been happening over a year. So if you go back to when I was at uni, I was very lucky. I wouldn't have been able to go to uni if I wasn't in the last year of the old system before the tuition fees got hiked. Vocational training, this goes back to the boys thing, right? Vocational training has been gutted in this country because we wanted to send everyone to uni, but we made it more expensive for them. If you look at what's on young people's minds, it's very basic stuff. They're not all social justice warriors at all. It's essentially food, family, shelter, right? So what's on their mind? Cost of living, housing, right? All these policies are not working for them. We were doing this research, when we went and did some of the ethnography for the latest project, I was out. It was just after the election and around the time of the riots. And we had very liberal, very thoughtful young men sitting there just tearing their hair out, talking to me saying, why is the triple lock pension so sacrosanct? We can't get a job. We can't go to university. We can't get a house. And the boomers who have got everything, politics has not been designed for young people. It's not working for young people. It's no surprise that young people in general are disenfranchised, to me, at all.
And it becomes this sort of this vicious circle. Young people don't vote because none of the political parties have policies that are reflecting their lives and their concerns, or at least reflecting their lives and their concerns in a way that feel that they will have a material positive impact on them. And so voting numbers go down, and therefore the political parties write manifestos and produce policies which actively exclude those young voters because they know they're not going to vote, and the people that they need to chase are those who have the triple lock pensions, or those who are concerned about inheritance tax, or those who are concerned about the cost of owning a second home. It's some political parties want to engage with young people, then they have to start by producing some policies and understanding their concerns.
We're talking, 7, 8, 9 million, depending on exactly where you draw the line. And they're essentially not represented. It's pure disenfranchisement.
Yet your report on the news and in the press, the headline kept being, young people don't believe in democracy, which I mean, for anybody who'd read the report or thought about it any further than those headlines, knew that the phrasing of the question didn't necessarily need to be interpreted that way.
Don't get your insight from journalists would be the main thing. What does it show? It shows anger. We think it's a cry for help as much as anything else. System's not working. Of course, I would like an alternative. If you had asked them a very slightly different question, but, would you prefer to live in a police state or in a free state, or would you want to live in a dictatorship? The numbers would have been lower. But the story within the data is consistent. We are not happy with the way that the socioeconomic system is working for us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the whole system of voting in a new parliament every 5 years. It causes problems for everything. It causes problems for young people in particular. It causes massive problems for the NHS because, of course, you can't think about health in 5-year cycles. There are loads of things really that should be taken out of the political system. And to me, it felt like young people kind of got that. They just thought, well, actually, the political system is failing our country in many ways because it doesn't work towards the things that matter for human beings. Yet we don't want to live in a dictatorship. Surely there's a second option here.
If you ask young people about Brexit, they will tell you that they don't care. It's ancient history. And I can totally see that because some of them were like 9 when it happened, right? So totally fair enough. But I think that Brexit is a generational issue in the sense that, well, essentially within about a few years, so many of the people who voted for it had been, what being statistics and demography called naturally replaced, which is a very kind word of saying passed on, that even if everybody had voted exactly the same way and not changed their mind, we wouldn't have left the EU, right? Let alone counting for the fact that lots of people have changed their minds. So it's just another example of how the system's wired for not us.
Yeah, I worked in the civil
Not them.
service for a long time, and it was super annoying when you're working on a policy you implement, is actually seeing results, and then a new government comes in and changes just because we want
Yeah.
to change it, not because it's not working, but we want to kind of stamp our authority, which is super annoying. Luckily, I'm free and doing this podcast now. Let's talk about the male attitude to kind of gender equality. So the report highlights that 20 to 30% of young men feel threatened by female equality, and nearly half, 45%, believe that efforts to promote women's equality have gone so far that men are now discriminated against. Now, we spoke earlier about education, employment, and men falling behind. So in one way, you can kind of see how those men feel disenfranchised themselves. But I think the harmful thing is when we see this as a zero-sum game, when we think, okay, well, our trials and tribulations, or the fact that we aren't getting the jobs or going to uni, is the fault of women. How do you think we can engage with young men, young boys, to move away from that kind of zero-sum thinking, where we can acknowledge that they have problems in themselves, but it's not necessarily the fault of women and girls?
So one of the things we should flag, I think, with this is that when you look at this research, gender is actually one of the lowest areas of contention when it comes to that sort of tension between two different groups. There's far more tension between Gen Z and older generations, boomers, when it comes to sort of placing the blame for their current situation. Gender's pretty low down on that. But it is there. I think partly it's an effect of not necessarily a particular sort of chasm that's opened up between boys and girls, men and women, but a natural reaction to a discourse which has become incredibly polarized. We live in a world where there is this constant sort of tension of right versus wrong, of A versus B, of this kind of zero-sum presentation, and the media is complicit in that, and the way that people are consuming their news and the way that their lives are mediated is in a way which is very zero-sum now. I think if you want to break out from that, you need to start telling stories that are more nuanced and have more of a narrative to them. Social media doesn't lend itself well to that. TikTok certainly doesn't lend itself well to that kind of storytelling. Traditional media is probably better placed for getting that kind of nuance across. But I think if you do want to reduce that kind of level of binary thinking and reduce the kind of binary components into which everything is presented these days, then a more nuanced, more narrative approach that takes time to build a story and to tell both sides of it, acknowledging that there is probably more than two sides to it, is probably the way to go.
It's not limited to Gen Z, but it is significantly higher amongst Gen Z because they've been socialized in this world, of these discourses, narratives. And if we take it back to your question, Elliot, about masculinity, we essentially have a sort of toxic versus ally framing. That is kind of the binary choice for a man. Now, I've got two daughters. I'm very lucky, and I'm doing a terrible thing that no researcher should ever do, and talking about their own experience. But I think it's instructive in this regard because I talk to other fathers of daughters and other fathers of sons, and the messaging for girls is really simple. You can be what you want to be. There's a plurality to the modeling and the identity that they can have. You want to go boxing, go boxing. You want to do your makeup, do your makeup. You want to play football, play football. You want to go shopping with the girls, go shopping with the girls, right? The boys, there isn't that palette of, I don't see the same wide-ranging palette of stories and the things that they can be. And
yeah, so interesting. I'm a dad of daughters as well. My 9-year-old will do martial arts and come home and put her makeup on.
Yeah.
And she is encouraged and allowed to be anything she wants. Like you spoke about storytelling, and as we are helping boys like navigate masculinities and what that means for them, at the moment they are sometimes seeing that storytelling from maybe harmful people online. And your report notes that we need role models to tell a different story. We've had lots of conversations about role models on this podcast and where they come from and whatnot. From your experience and your work, where do you think those role models should come from? Is it the online world? Is it in the house? Is it in the community? Well, what do you think about that?
When we talked to the kids we talked to in this, we found this really heartening. When we talked to them about the people they looked up to, it was their dads, it was their teachers, it was their granddads, it was the people their coaches at football, it was youth workers. It's not about celebrities. It's not about online role models or, it's a cop out to think that, what's going on is like the lack of sort of proper role models on TikTok or on Insta or on TV. It starts at home and in the communities that these kids are growing up in. And I think that's where these role models need to be modeling those kind of behaviors that Conrad's talking about, those multiplicities of masculinities that go beyond that kind of binary of toxic versus ally.
One of the most shocking statistics in the 3 years that James and I were working on this study together, actually doesn't come from our data at all. It comes from sort of a load of the research that we did. And it's that 33% of primary schools in this country do not have a single male teacher in them. It's just unacceptable. Right? We cannot expect boys to, grow up into reasonably balanced individuals if they don't have role models on a day-to-day basis in the teaching environment where they spend the most time at a really formative age. It's stuff. Yeah, it helps to have Marcus Rashford or whoever. That's great. That's wonderful. But Marcus Rashford's going to have less impact than Coach Rashford on a Saturday morning.
Yeah. There's one male teacher at the school my kids are at, and he is hero worshipped. All of the kids. I mean, he's got tats. He's very young and cool. He plays pranks. The kids just absolutely hero worship him because he's the only male teacher and because he's, he is a role model to all of the kids, the boys and the girls. The girls look up to him as, this is an example of a good man as well. It's really important that you have a good gender balance in primary schools and secondary schools. I agree.
So Jolie, you and your partner are two full-time busy working parents. And I know you don't have your parents close by or that village or the support nearby. How do you cope with all of this?
Well, the simple answer is we don't. We're both losing our marbles constantly. But thankfully, we did find Bubble childcare, and it's been a total game changer. We were really nervous about having a stranger come into our house, but we found Sarah. She's a primary school teacher who is doing some babysitting and nannying on the side. She came and met with us. The kids absolutely adore her. She is just brilliant. She babysat for us a couple of weeks ago, and she even made the kids their dinner. And now the kids just want us to go out all the time so that they can have Sarah. We've used her for emergency backup care. It's saved our relationship. It's saved our careers. We just love Bubble.
Find and book background checked nannies and sitters who can be with you in as little as an hour. Trusted by parents like us. Search Bubble Childcare in the App Store or Google Play Store. Let's talk about the groups. So I found this fascinating how you kind of went into those 6 perspective worldview groups. And I'll talk a little bit about those. So from the report, it says these 6 groups reveal kind of diverse attitudes, values, and responses to the challenges young people face. It says a young person can belong to more than one of those groups at any time. They are nuanced groups that can intersect. Some groups feel driven to challenge norms or fight for fairness. Others grapple with exclusion, frustration, and apathy. And there were two groups that I saw kind of heavily included young men. There were the Boys Can't Be Boys group, around 14% of Gen Z, young men and women who feel trapped by shifting gender expectations, struggling to reconcile traditional masculinity with modern societal norms. They often perceive themselves as under attack, feeling alienated and disconnected from progressive narratives. And I guess they will be the boys that we've kind of been discussing so far in the last conversation, I guess, as well. The second group, which I'm really interested in, the blank slates, around 20%. I love the name, blank slates. 20% of Gen Z, all male, neutral, disinterested young men. This engaged group is particularly young and prioritizes hobbies and ships and everyday life over societal concerns. They are apolitical, focused on leisure and personal enjoyment rather than activism or cultural commentary. Now, out of those 2 groups, when I think about the young men that are in my life, whether they are kind of family or my friends' children, or the young men I've met through my work, I would say definitely the blank slates group is the one that I would see more regularly. People who are very much kind of just concerned with self and are really into the gym, really into success, really into their career, their studies, like they've got their own thing going on. And they're not too interested in changing the world. Should we be concerned about that group, knowing what we know around the political climate, the economic climate? Should we be worried about that mindset, or is that kind of a natural part of growing up as well?
That's just one of the sort of classic pressures that we've put on Generation Z, though, isn't it? That we expect them to be woke, that we expect them to have some kind of political opinion about things, and that we expect them to not just to have that as an opinion, but to be some kind of, to activate that against those politics in some ways. And I think, yes, some will, but you're always going to get probably a significant majority who may think about these things, but don't think about it particularly keenly, and it doesn't affect them particularly powerfully. And they're certainly not going to glue themselves to a road over it.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because actually, Elliot, we called them blank slates for a reason, but we think about these names very carefully. And partly was the fact that they are sometimes quite blank, looking like they'll just look at you when you ask them a sort of kind of like socio-political question or a socio-cultural question. They're just like, what are you talking about, man? I just want to play FIFA, right? Which is fine. Yeah. It's cool, right? That's okay, right? But the other reason is that they're very young. So one of the things that we think is that, that we found out is that it's just still forming. And it's very early for, the 13-year-old to be able to be thinking about some of this stuff when they haven't even chosen their GCSE options yet, right? And that's cool too. But what we were worried about was this was the group that could be converted, right? This is the group that could turn into Jamie from adolescence, right? And it turned out that, by meeting them and talking to them and listening to them, actually, it was the dice are loaded group that really, really need to be worried about, right? So you haven't picked them out here, but they're the group who essentially see the world through the prism of unfairness. The system is rigged against us. It's an unfair place, and I don't really feel I can do very much about it, right? So the blank slates, they might be still happy playing FIFA or having a few pints and going to the football or whatever it is, and they might never think about the world outside of that. But that also means that they're probably not going to be seduced by Andrew Tate's bigger arguments or Jordan Peterson or whatever, that kind of stuff. The dice are loaded are the more fertile territory, actually, because there's a sense of rage and resentment there.
What percentage of
they're all about the same size. They're all
about 20%.
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting, right, is that the girl power group, right? People, when we communicate this, right, we chose girl power for a reason. We call them the Spice Girls daughters. Theirs is a sort of apolitical feminism. They might not even describe themselves as feminists, and that so they weren't thinking generally in big terms about the world or gender equality or anything like that. But what made them different is that they had a positive gender-based narrative around which they could coalesce, right? They could just see the world through those terms that we were talking about, Elliot, about go boxing, do your makeup, do football. And the boys didn't have the same thing, the same story, the same set of messages to group around.
We've talked about that a bit on the podcast, about the notion that we're saying to girls, you are strong, you are clever, you can work in childcare, but you can also be an astrophysicist. But yet with boys, the narrative really hasn't changed that much. It's stuck with very male-led sectors in terms of the career you're going to go into. Also still this narrative about physical strength is very pervasive. We haven't managed to also have the conversation with boys about them being childcare workers, working in caring, being a nurse, being more emotionally led in the way that they behave. That just hasn't trickled through. So they don't have the personalities and personas available to them that girls have, which you've already touched on, but you say that very well. And when looking at these different types of people within Gen Z category,
it's also important to say that the dice are loaded are actually pretty gender balanced, right? So yeah. there are a lot of
interesting.
There are a lot of women who are pretty peed off with the state of the world too.
The stat 44% think that things have gone too far in favour of girls over boys, women over men. Do they tend to come from dice and loaded? Or are they, again, it's just a good split across the groups?
If you talk to some people who hold that view, there's a whole range of within that people who hold that view, because you might agree with that and think it's a good thing. Right? If you're and I spoke to men who are like, that is true, and it needs to happen because we need to correct centuries of patriarchy and gender inequality and sexism and misogyny and we need to suck it up. That we've had these advantages. Some will see that. We equally have talked to young women who think it is a bad thing because they hold quite traditional values, and quite often they come from religious backgrounds where they really strongly hold, almost at a cultural level, traditional gender roles. And they're worried about it because they're like, well, I'm supposed to be doing this and he's supposed to be doing that. And society isn't giving us the space for us to live out our culture. It's very, very nuanced.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the nuance because I think that's what the podcast is for, is kind of getting underneath the data. This research was done by Channel 4, obviously a traditional media outlet. And the report was really interesting in regards to letting us know kind of where Gen Z get their information from and what information sources they trust the most. And it showed there was a kind of flatter hierarchy of trust when it comes to information sources. Gen Z in general will be a lot more trusting of online influencers. Interestingly, older people are also trusting of kind of social media posts as well, but a lot more of traditional media than Gen Z would be. What does that mean for, I guess, how we communicate and the flow of information and the risk of misinformation spreading and pushing further divides between people?
Well, it is patently hugely dangerous, and I don't think like kids and like the people who are consuming that media want to be bombarded with a whole slew of false information and have to sort of put it on themselves to work out what's true and what's not. It does mean that we need a sort of a legislative body, or a body in the form of Ofcom that is powerful enough to have an effect on these media outlets, on these broadcasters. And I know that TikTok, Facebook, Meta, Instagram, all of them, none of them want to be seen as broadcasters because they would then have to adhere to broadcast codes. But it is what they are. And I think that's what we should be treating them as. And they should be punished when they don't obey the rules. And we need a government who's prepared to stand up to Silicon Valley and to leaders like JD Vance who see free speech as in some way, protection of free speech is in some way protecting the US's financial interests. We need to stand up to that really, really strongly, because it's only going to go one direction, and that is going to be a race to the bottom.
Yeah. I mean, it's an outcome of the internet, right? The genie's not going to go back in the bottle. You can't do anything about the phenomenon beyond regulate those who are providing the platform for the phenomenon. And they're not going to put their hand up and ask for regulation, because which business ever does? But also, these are companies that are born out of a libertarian culture that, it believes philosophically in the freedom to do what it wants and to go around moving fast and breaking things. It cannot come from within, and they've proven that. Even if they say they care, and I'm not saying that there are people there who everyone there doesn't care, they do not care enough versus their own profit motive.
Does that look like in reality, though? If you start regulating YouTube and you say you post a video on YouTube and it's factually inaccurate, are we saying then that there would be a code that commands YouTube to take that video down?
Yeah,
yes, that's how Ofcom runs it. Yeah,
you can't tell lies on the news, which you're not supposed to. You can't tell lies in advertising, right? We have structures in more traditional media. Same with newspapers, right? The whole premise is that the social networks are basically basing their defense on is we are not publishers. Yeah. We are tech platforms. All we do is provide the code in nice ones and zeros, binary thinking. Right? All we do is provide the code and let it out there, and it's up to the people to be responsible, right? Well, we don't allow that in any other medium. We shouldn't allow it online.
Yeah, and last week there was the new online safety bill controls that were released. And I think the conversation is always going to be, how are they going to be implemented? Is Ofcom actually going to do that, or is it going to be a piece of paper and a policy that's kind of sat there and not ever enacted on? To end, so with your report, I'm really interested, a lot of our audience are parents of boys. Are there things that you have done differently as parents off the back of the report?
I've got two Gen Zers. Look, one of the things that, aside from some of the sort of the scare stories and some of the headlines around this research, one of the things, and this happened with the first time we did this research, so when we did the original Beyond Z research, it made me really heartened to see how lovely kids in Britain actually are today. It filled me with a huge amount of warmth that, that the kids are, despite the world that they're growing up in, and despite, like all of the sort of the concerns that we have around the way in which social media and toxic politics are affecting things, they're growing up into really, really lovely, caring, thoughtful kids. It's made me, listening to these kids, it probably makes you want to, listen more. It's, I think, it probably hasn't changed my parenting style at all, but it's made me want to make sure that I am listening more, that I'm sort of watching out for the kind of signs and concerns that you might have around some of the sort of the more lurid stats and lurid headlines that appear in this kind of research. I've talked to them about this research, and I've talked to them about some of the findings, and sort of like find out whether it rings true for them, whether it rings true for their friends at school. And yeah, it's just sort of made me more positive than negative, I think.
I love that.
I think that's really important, because we've got a tendency to catastrophize, and we've got a tendency to try and problem solve, right? So we ignore the fact that the vast majority are happy, right? Although happiness is falling, but still we ignore all of those things. I think for me, some of what I'm going to say is going to sound really trite, all right? But it's about listening, it's about understanding, and it's about loving. These are just the basics of at least what I understand as parenting, what I try to do, not all the time. I think for boys specifically, you asked us the question about sons, Elliot, previously. And I think we talked about role models previously, and fathers, right? Not saying, you need to have your traditional 2.4, it's not 2.4 anymore, but, that nuclear family, right? But if there are fathers present, fathers really need to step up. I've actually been shocked, right, as part of this research, who is interested. And Elliot, I've got to say, you're one of the very few men who I've spoken to about this research. It's the mothers of the sons who are interested in this more so than the fathers seem to be. And I think that goes back to our role models conversation and our behavior modeling conversation and all that kind of stuff. And it's starting at home, right? We wouldn't tolerate a feminism that's being designed and communicated purely or mainly through the male gaze. And that's not to say we don't want women involved in these conversations. Of course we do. The mothers are super important, but where are the dads? There are some out there, but by the sounds of it, not enough. And, in that same way that we need promoted these, empowering messages of you can be what you want to be to girls, it's up to the dads in large part to model good behaviors that give the boys positive examples of all the range of what they can be, rather than framing what quite often for young boys is a message of you should be this or you can't be that. And that's just not helpful, I think.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Konrad and James. I feel like we could Jenny, you're going to come in.
I just want to ask one other guy.
Go for it. That's our sign. She was when we're going to come in. Go for it, Joe. I'll sit back.
I just want to know, because this have two boys, 9 and 11, and they are obsessed with what generation everybody is. So my youngest is Gen Alpha, and he's constantly, well, you wouldn't understand, Mum, because you're not Gen Alpha. I'm Gen Alpha. He calls me a boomer. I'm like, no, I am not a boomer.
That just means adult.
Well, I thought boomer was
I know.
Born in the 1950s.
The technical definition, you're right. It is that generation, but like they just use it as in that is basically just an insult. You're an old person who doesn't know what you're talking about.
I'm very used to being called an old person by my kids. But why? Like, we never talked about this when we were younger. We never talked about what generation people were from. Where has this obsession come from with what gen you are? Why is every kid seemingly so obsessed with it?
Well, it's not just the kids, is it? It's the press, it's in the discourse. There's a whole industry that's set up. My industry is partly guilty for this. James's industry.
Is it your fault, Konrad?
My fault. And but it's James's fault for making it commercially lucrative by buying this stuff, right? It's true that the idea of a generation is not a new generation. The fetishization of the generations, you're going to get a reasonably long answer. Now, you can trace this back to the millennials, right? There's a book, and the it's called Millennials Rising, and it's set in train this whole trend to look at life and change in society and culture through this lens of age and generations, right? It's not the only thing that matters, but it's so seductive because it plays to some of our deepest fears and hopes, right? Generational friction is useful and good and natural. I start my presentations with this with a quote from Socrates. I do a little quiz thing, just like, who do you think said this? And people go, oh, it's the Victorians. You know, like a couple of people have got close, but no one's ever gone as far back as Socrates, right? So it's debatable whether he actually said it, but it doesn't matter.
What's the quote? Say the quote.
Oh gosh, it is children these days are tyrants. They gobble their food, chatter before company, and disobey their parents.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not changed then, has it?
There you go. It's a story as it's a story as old as time itself. The reason being serious, the reason we are obsessed with it, we have started to label everything, right? In terms of these, where you're alpha, you're this, the cohorts are getting tighter and tighter because the industry needs to sell more and more and more of it, right? And we're very clear, if you look at the Beyond Z research, we're very clear to say that generation doesn't matter as much as you think it does, right? But then the other thing is that, when I was saying it plays to our greatest fears, as older people, we perpetuate these things because we are scared of change, right? And like I said, generational friction is normal, and that it's what drives progress, right? But also, from a more positive perspective, we care and worry and love and care about and worry about our children. And so we also want to look through this lens of them and us.
Yeah. Okay. But I am a boomer as well. That's what I'm taking away from that.
Are you actually I thought you're a millennial, Jodie.
I imagine you're a millennial. You're a millennial.
Yeah, I must be a millennial. I keep forgetting what I am.
Konrad, James, it's been a pleasure.
Thank
we
you
could
for having
talk for way longer. I think we've got deep, but at the same time, there's so much more to discuss, and maybe we can do it in the future again. So, Konrad, James, thank you so much. We appreciate the conversation. Take care. Thank you for coming on the podcast. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.
I'm a transformation director with 15 years experience helping businesses make major change. I bring a deep understanding of problem solving, trend analysis, and stakeholder engagement. I'm able to operate at both executive and team level. I'm personable and pragmatic with a huge passion for my work.
Pregnancy and maternity discrimination shreds the careers of 74,000 women every year. At Pregnant Then Screwed, we can stop it. Visit careershredder.com to show your support.